Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. You can join Brian Curtis and myself for the stories making news and moving markets in the APAC region. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.
And joining us now for some discussion on this is Alex Barinka, Bloomberg Tech Reporter. We should add there are a number of interesting angles here, not least of which is the conduct versus content arguments of the algorithm. And that was something that we just heard there from Mark Ginsburg. But also the political angle, the legal angle. And then it brings us to what happens in the Senate. So we know that the House passed it easily, even though Donald Trump expressed reservations. Will that be a big issue in the Senate, and what are we expecting there?
It certainly might. You know, the Senate's been a place where some House bills have certainly gone to die, and still so far, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has not yet endorsed this bill, even though there are concerns from folks on both sides of the aisle, not only about the content on TikTok, but as well as kind of the fear of Chinese influence. So I will say this is the furthest a bill that would limit TikTok has gone. This bill is different because it doesn't just call for an outright ban. It actually calls for a divestiture, although the company says that's in essence a ban. So while we've seen kind of TikTok be stuck in these machinations as you kind of ran through them, the America-China relationship, the fear of kids on social media, the data collection question that's been out there for almost years now since Trump was president, this is the one that seems to at least have the most momentum. And look, it moved incredibly quickly from introduction to passing this morning in the U.S. in the House of Representatives.
I'm curious about the lobbying efforts. I was reading a story on Bloomberg, Alex. Jeff Yass, who is the mastermind behind Susquehanna International, he owns a stake in the parent company, ByteDance. I think it's worth around $15 billion. And from what I understand, Mr. Yass has used a lot of his wealth, nearly $41 billion fortune, to become the largest donor in the current election cycle. We're going to see a lot of money thrown at members of the Senate to try to block this bill from becoming law?
We certainly might, and we already have. ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, which is the company under which they register their lobbyists, spent a record $8.7 million on federal lobbying last year alone. They have about 4 dozen lobbyists who work for them, trying to kind of sway opinion in D.C., but it seems like some of those folks might have been surprised by this. Yass in particular is a very big name, the one that often operates behind the scenes with that Susquehanna stake. He has reportedly been meeting with Trump, who, if you've been following the headlines on all this week, President Trump, when he was in office, was the first to write the executive order to potentially ban TikTok. But in the last few days, he said, wait, TikTok should actually stay because banning it would give Meta and Mark Zuckerberg too much power. So that kind of lobbying machine has been working behind the scenes, but it's clear maybe that something in that big kind of hoard of dollars that's gone towards lobbying is not quite hitting with the voices in D.C., just given how kind of quickly this has gone through the House.
And even if it does pass, we understand that there will be legal challenges that might last for years. I'm curious, what are you hearing about what would happen in the meantime?
Absolutely. We broke the news earlier this week that TikTok sees a divestiture as the last resort, that they will exhaust every single legal challenge possible. That was confirmed by a statement from TikTok CEO in the last hour that they posted on social media, saying that we will continue to do everything we can, including exercise our legal rights. So we could see kind of a pretty long, drawn out battle that they might take here. We saw a little bit of flavor flavor of that in Montana. The governor of Montana signed a bill into law in that state to ban TikTok. There was a suit there that bill ended up being kind of abandoned after creators on TikTok actually brought a suit. So that might just be one flavor of what we see here. We already see TikTok talking a lot about constitutional rights. We've seen them bring up the First Amendment argument. And I'm sure as this kind of continues, if this does get signed into law, there will be several additional legal venues that I, in this moment, am not even imagining that they take, because they see this as such an urgent fight that they kind of do not want to lose or end up in a divestiture situation.
You know, you mentioned the Trump executive order, the attempt at that during his administration. I remember the story around Oracle and Larry Ellison trying to maybe weigh in if there was some type of forced sale. But from what I understand, Oracle did become a beneficiary in that I think it won a contract to host the video library. Is that not right? That Oracle is using its kind of data service to host a lot of the content that TikTok produces?
They are. Oracle's been kind of the American partner that TikTok's lifted up. Oracle's been working with TikTok on something that TikTok calls Project Texas, which is their solution that they've spent more than $1 billion on to kind of allay those national security concerns. They are hosting U.S. users' data on TikTok data centers, on Oracle data centers. They are allowing Oracle to kind of audit source code and look at algorithms and content moderation policies. They're basically saying, look, we have this American homegrown partner here who is kind of standing in to protect the data, and Oracle is in this business relationship with them. I will note, though, there has been something interesting as all of this has played out very publicly in Washington, D.C. Oracle's voice has been very silent. We have not heard from them. So for the moment, they seem to be a business partner only.
Yeah, it's not big enough anymore. I mean, TikTok has just gotten so big, who could afford to buy it? I mean, you are talking about a monster now that Oracle, I seriously doubt, would be big enough. It would have to be one of the biggest companies in America that could afford to buy a company like TikTok now that has how many? 150 million viewers? It's getting kind of
170 million every month.
Okay.
And that is certainly kind of what the shortlist would be if this would end up in a sale to another company. But you'll remember the Biden administration has a FTC, an antitrust regulator, who's been very, very tough on big tech.
Yeah,
so when you start going down the list
thing.
of names, it gets a little tough when you think of Meta or Alphabet. Like, who would this end with that would keep regulators happy?
And the other thing, to apply a little bit of context, that we're in an election year, and it's not a done deal yet. And if there is a second Trump administration, what happens then?
It's an interesting question, particularly now that Trump has kind of flip-flopped, even though Republicans have been a lot of the agitators against TikTok all of these days. I will say the interesting part might actually happen in the lead up to the election as well. TikTok users, a majority of them are actually against a ban, according to a survey late last year from Pew Research. So voters might not be super in favor of this if they are one of those 170 million users of TikTok. And when you look at younger users, they are the cohort that is most against a TikTok ban. So as these senators are sizing up and looking at whether or not they vote for this bill, that must be something that they consider in terms of November election season.
Yeah, there's really a lot of acrimony attached to this. President Biden on TikTok, or at least the re-election campaign, and yet he would sign the bill. It's fair to mention for our listeners, this really isn't a ban. It's a forced divestiture. And no American internet companies can operate in China. So there's that. Thanks to Alex Barinka. This is Bloomberg.
Joe Deaux, who covers metals and mining. He joins us from here in New York City. Joe, it's always a pleasure. Let's not forget the fact that it's an election year. Mr. Biden in the past has been very much on the side of labor. The United Steelworkers, as we know, are very much involved in this, trying to win better terms from Nippon. Where are we in this process right now?
Yeah, it is another step in what seems to be already a very long process, right? And the steelworkers just had their first meeting with Nippon Steel, which is supposed to be the beginning of talks or discussions or maybe eventually outright negotiations as to Nippon Steel taking over the labor agreement of the steelworkers. The steelworkers themselves can't block this deal, but they do hold a lot of political sway. And the political sway, of course, is, as you said, Joe Biden's support of unions, in particular the steelworkers. And we get this comment today, or we get this reporting today that the president is preparing to make a statement that would, show that he has some concerns about the deal to the prime minister of Japan.
I'm curious whether investors really want this deal to go through at the moment, given all the scrutiny and a lot of the angst that centers around it. And it's a little surprising, I guess, that there is this much in the U.S. We've had Japanese companies buying American companies in the past, but is the reason that U.S. Steel is U.S. Steel and that it has this long sort of heartland history?
Yeah, exactly. It is a company that everybody knows, even though it hasn't been the dominant name that it once was. The last time United States Steel was the largest steelmaker in the United States was, around the year 2000. And the last time it was one of the most important companies in the world was back when, people's parents were either young people or just starting out in college, depending on their age. Like this is a name that everybody knows, but probably people haven't followed in a very long time. And that's why we're here, right? It still stands for something in the eyes of readers. I don't know if in the eyes of investors it stands for more than a takeover target, right? And that's really how we have this kind of weird dichotomy of iconic name, but it's also being bought for a reason. It went through a lot of trouble in the 2010s. At one point, many analysts thought this company might go bankrupt. They made some good moves. It made them attractive, and that's where they are today. And it just so happens that a Japanese buyer wants to get in on the deal and made an incredible offer, right? I mean, they offered $55 a share, $14.1 billion. And all of that leads to one wild politics story because it's 2024.
So we've talked about the union and the impending election, but there's also a CFIUS review here and the grounds of national security. Is there a case to be made that this deal needs to be blocked under kind of national security concerns?
Well, ultimately, it will be up to the various agencies within the executive branch to make a decision if they think that's the case. Some of the reporting that my colleague Josh Wingrove and I had back not too long ago was that the administration had some concerns about connections that Nippon Steel has with China. In particular, they have 9 facilities inside China that produce 3.6 million tons of value-added steel products. It's actually not that much. It's just a fraction of their total production. And on the scale of U.S. production, that's nothing. But the fact that they still seem to be looking at that does raise questions, I think, to various people who have been watching this, as to whether or not the CFIUS will determine that there is a national security problem. It's impossible to tell at this point. They still have to go through the entire investigation process. Treasury, Defense Department, and Commerce Department, they all need to weigh in on this thing. And ultimately, it could be, this is some reporting that I had a couple weekends ago, that it might not necessarily be a national security issue from a defense standpoint, but this rising economic national security issue that we all became aware of during the Trump administration, right? And that is, if the administration feels like the loss of some steel mills from U.S. Steel and the loss of steel jobs with those U.S. Steel plants poses some sort of economic security issue, then they might raise that as a reason that this deal not necessarily gets blocked, but that there have to be some changes. It's unclear what that might be, but we did have one expert say, it could be that CFIUS says to Nippon, hey, you have to make some promises to keep these mills open or to keep these jobs because it is a national security concern. But again, that's so far in the future, it's unclear if those are even the things that are being discussed.
Joe, thanks very much. It's always a pleasure. Joe Deaux, Bloomberg Metals and Mining Reporter.
All right, joining us now in our studios here in Hong Kong to talk about Chinese tech and policy going forward, the NPC meetings, and a whole lot more is Sarah Zheng, who is Bloomberg's China Technology Reporter. I just was very interested, Sarah, in reading through your notes when you came back about how lots of delegates would trot out the phrase new productive forces, but then when you would try to get details on how this would actually allow China to compete with the United States on AI. They would say something like, I haven't gotten into that yet, and then scurry off to something else. How frustrating was it for you in terms of getting real information from the delegates?
Yes, exactly. So this phrase that you mentioned, new productive forces, that's really the latest buzzword that we've been hearing from Xi Jinping and from the central government. And so that's obviously what us as reporters wanted to know more about, right? So a lot of us were trying to ask some of the NPC, which is the National People's Congress, the National Legislature delegates, and also delegates to this centralized advisory body to the government at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing about this phrase. It's the first time that they were holding these annual party meetings after COVID, so we were hoping to get more access. We were able to be there in person this time compared to last year and the year before, but unfortunately people were not that willing to talk to us. They would say, oh, this phrase is really important, we need to focus on it, but when you ask them what it actually means in tangible terms, that's something that was a lot harder for people to spell out, or less willing for them to spell out.
When I think of the business world in China, there are kind of two strands. There's the private sector, and then there's kind of the state and state-owned enterprises. And when you hear that term, new productive forces, does it apply equally to kind of both camps, or does it skew more toward kind of the state-sponsored enterprise?
I think based on some of the conversations we were able to have when we cornered some of these delegates, the way that people describe it is a combination of sort of cutting edge tech innovation on AI and chips, and then on building talent, a big base of tech talent, and then education. So these three sort of main areas. And obviously, state-owned enterprises, the sort of state-backed tech sectors, those are the most important parts. We've seen over the last few years, Beijing really cracking down on the internet industry, but they're still very supportive of the tech sector. And by tech, they mean AI, chips, like these hard tech things that you mentioned, science and tech research that can help elevate their overall tech level and bring them closer to where the U.S. is.
Well, and there's a little bit of muscle coming because they talked about a 10% increase in the budget for science and technology. It's not a small number, $51.6 billion. That could make a difference. And I'm curious what you heard from some of the delegates that you spoke to about, how that money might be deployed.
Exactly, that's right. There is this 10% increase. And actually, when you see the level of spending on science and tech research over the last few years, it's at the highest level in the last 5 or 6 years, especially because of a small dip during COVID. We don't know exactly how it will be deployed yet, but they say that the focus will be on basic research. And so that just plays into this whole idea that the central government is really focused on promoting national champions, state-owned enterprises, and the fundamental underlying research, like in things like quantum computing and chips, that can help to lead to homegrown scientific breakthroughs and give them this tech self-reliance that they're going for.
Yeah, I think the elephant in the room, the U.S. export controls on the most advanced semiconductor making equipment, right? I mean, the U.S. has put pressure on Dutch companies, on Japanese firms as well, to try to prevent China from accessing the most sophisticated types of equipment. I hear what you're saying in terms of R&D, but I think a reasonable market watcher, or someone who has a kind of a relatively modest sense of expertise in the chip industry, knows that this is a years-long slog that it's going to take to China to try to catch up in the absence of access to those technologies.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think that's the issue right now. Everyone knows that you need a huge amount of capital in order to create some of these tech innovations that they need to catch up on the chip side, especially when the U.S. is mulling further chip sanctions. And so that's why we saw things like this so-called big fund. It's this state-backed fund where they're trying to raise money from state-owned enterprises and local governments to just pour that into chip making in particular, because they know how difficult and how capital intensive this venture will be.
So in some ways you wonder, how to achieve that goal, because some of it is the economic muscle, the money poured into R&D. Some of it is just the innovation, the ingenuity, and you need a little bit of freedom for that. So that's something that perhaps China could use some progress on. But then if you look at, many companies like Baidu, they have achieved some great successes even in AI. And if you look at a company like Tencent and Alibaba, in many ways they went past American companies in their development on the internet in the past. So it's not completely out of the question.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think what tech experts and people in the industry will say is that China is often better at the U.S. in terms of things like application, like the things that you mentioned on the internet sector. We've seen Tencent with WeChat and Alibaba with Alipay. All of these sort of tech application level things are things that China is very good at. When it comes to actually innovating at a fundamental level, though, that's a different story.
Well, you need freedom for that, don't you?
That's true. And that's why in generative AI right now, we're talking a little bit about how some of the restrictions on the content side and, government oversight over some of these companies is sort of inhibiting the freewheeling innovation you might need, or that we're seeing in the U.S. and Silicon Valley, to sort of just go all in on generative AI. Because with some of these guardrails in place, it's harder to get to the training level that you need to create, a real rival to OpenAI in China.
Big story today in the U.S. is this House bill that passed to ban TikTok in the U.S. unless the owners in China, that being ByteDance, sells. We know that the leadership in China has been opposed to that notion. I'm wondering, though, can you imagine a world where TikTok becomes a bargaining chip to try to get access to the things that it would like to have from the U.S. in exchange for an agreement to kind of offload this asset and allow an American company to own it entirely?
I do think stranger things have happened, but this would be, it would bring things to a completely unprecedented level to have what's in name a private company used as a bargaining chip in this way. I mean, we saw this sort of happen with Huawei, but to use TikTok and data that the Chinese government has said is sensitive and they do not want to be exported, to have that kind of algorithm technology used as a bargaining chip to get chips from the U.S., I feel like that would be at the moment, it still seems quite unlikely.
Can you give me 25 seconds on China looking at an AI assistant for neurosurgeons?
For neurosurgeons.
Yeah, that's something we don't have enough time, actually. I think what we'll do is we'll save that for the next time. Just looking at that story, that one of the things that you need to know today in a piece that appeared on the Bloomberg Terminal. We'll get to that in another session with Sarah Zheng here with us from Bloomberg China Technology.
This has been the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast, bringing you the stories making news and moving markets in the Asia Pacific. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to get more episodes of this and other shows from Bloomberg. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.